But he's going to teach this to something that might be new to the believers that are there. And so we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that Paul starts to talk about this idea of, man, we desire to have this peace. We desire to have this freedom that comes in Christ. But as we talked about last week, and as we're going to dive down deeper into this week, freedom doesn't often look like what we think freedom looks like in our Western mind. We think freedom, like no one can tell me what to do. And that's not what Jesus teaches. And that's not what Paul teaches. Because the reality is that in freedom, somebody is teaching us what to do. In freedom, we are saying, man, I want to set someone up as master of our life. And so to get there, before we turn to Romans chapter 6, we want to begin in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 19. It says this: do not accumulate for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and devouring insect destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But accumulate for yourself treasures in heaven where moth and devouring insect do not destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So Jesus is teaching about the power of our treasures. And he's going to get into, later on in the verse we'll get to in just a second, he's going to get into language that is kind of similar to what we're going to read in Romans chapter 6. But Jesus is teaching, then, what are the things that we most treasure in our life? What are the things that most hold value? Because whatever we treasure, that's what our heart is going to focus on. So I want you to think about a couple of things this morning. I want you to begin to think about, now I know you're in church, and if I went around and asked, what's the most important thing in your life right now? Because you're in church, what's your answer going to be? Jesus. Like, hopefully that's the answer. We're in church. That should be like the Sunday school answer is Jesus. But the reality is that this is something that you and I, we battle. Like, what are the things that we treasure in our life? What are the things that all week long bring us our identity? So think about this. Don't think about it just in a spiritual context because you're in church. But think about this week. What were the things that you are most focused on? What were the things that you most treasured? Now, hopefully Jesus enters into that picture, but the reality is that you and I, we're humans. We have a tendency to build up treasures here on earth that seem incredibly important to us. So what are the things this week that we really treasured? What were the things that we thought, man, if I get this week is going to be really good? Now, hold on to that. Think about what that is, but hold on to that. Now think back to 10 years ago. 10 years ago, if you're younger, maybe 5 years ago. But if you're like me, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, what was the thing that, man, if you had this in your life would be successful? If you had this in your life, man, that would be the things that we hold most dear. Man, 10 years ago, if I could just get this, if I could just have this, then, man, my life would have traction, I'd have purpose, I'd have worth. And then I get that and I realize that didn't bring the measure of satisfaction I thought it would. So much so that 10 years later, I treasure something else. And go ahead and put that passage back up there for a second, Alex. And it says the idea that, man, whatever I treasure most important, that's where my heart is. And so where my treasure is, that's what my heart is focused on all week long. And so Jesus says, listen, we have a tendency to do this, so let me focus on this. He says, don't worry about accumulating these things for yourself, treasures on earth. We all do this. We all want things. There's nothing wrong with the things. It's when we treasure the things. It's when our passion is about those things. Our identity is in those things. The teaching isn't that money is the root of all evil. It's that the love of money is the root of all evil. When those things become our treasure, when those things become the things that we most value. And so Jesus is saying, don't get caught up in that game because it's never going to bring satisfaction. And those things are going to come and go. That car that you really, really want, chances are 15 years from now, it's not going to run any longer. The promotion you want at work, 10 or 15 years from now, you're going to be tired of. Like the things that we think, if I just get this, there's nothing wrong with those things. But if those things become the things that we treasure, they become our master. And so Jesus says, don't let those things be the things that you most treasure, that you most value. Later on in this passage, down in verse 24, it says this: no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. You cannot serve God and your stuff. Now, Jesus was writing that into a very different cultural context that we live in today. And yet I think the truth is still very much there. I think we as Christians, we want to, if I came into church and I said, what's the most important thing? We say, man, Jesus is the number one thing in our life. And yet we continue to have treasure and value in these other things to say, man, but if I had this, I know Jesus is enough, but if I had this. And Jesus is saying, you can't have two masters. It's impossible for you to have two masters. And if you start to value one over the other, then that becomes the master of your life. And he uses language that is very similar to what we read in the book of Romans chapter 6. So with that as kind of a backdrop, I want to flip to Romans chapter 6. And we're going to look back to what we looked at last week, one verse, and then we're going to get into Romans chapter 6. But in Romans chapter 6, verse 1, he begins with this question. He says, what shall we say? Are we to remain in sin so that grace may increase? And the answer to that is absolutely not. Very similar to what we see at the beginning of our text this morning. This morning we begin in verse 15. What then? Shall not. He says, do you not? He says, do you not know that if you present yourselves as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, either of sin and resulting in death, or obedience resulting in righteousness? But he said, but thanks be to God that though you were slaves to sin, this is who we were naturally. He said, though you were slaves to sin, you obeyed from the heart that pattern of teaching that you were entrusted to. And having been freed from sin, you became enslaved to righteousness. He says, I'm speaking in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. For just as you were once presented your members as slaves to impurity and lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present your bodies as slaves to righteousness, leading to sanctification. For when you were slaves of sin, you were free with regard to righteousness. The question in verse 15 sounds very similar to where Paul began this whole teaching in Romans chapter 6, verse 1. The questions sound very, very much alike, but there is a subtle and distinct difference. We had left off last week with this passage that said that we're no longer under the law, but we're under grace. And so Paul begins the next paragraph by saying, well, if we're not under the law anymore, then he asks in verse 15, if we're not under the law, shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? Since we're not under the law, he says, are we still required to obey the law? Or can we go and do whatever we want? And his response to that is that even though there's not the same legal implications that there was before, that you're now living under grace, that absolutely not. Because at some point, Jesus had already taught that you can't have two masters. But Paul adds to that teaching here. He says you can't have two masters, but you got to have